All right,
So today's lecture is on the skeletal system, at least the introduction to it. I'm not going to do this like I normally do my lectures, so if you at any point feel like I'm moving too quickly, make sure you just pause the video and get down what you need to get down. And if you have any questions, please come see me outside of this. So the skeletal system, it's kind of one of those classic systems that you think of when you take an anatomy course, and we're going to have to know like all of the bones, except for the specific ones of the wrist and the specific vertebrae and the specific ones in the ankles. We'll call them collectively certain things. But this is going to really feel, I think, the most like an anatomy course does in college. So when we talk about the skeletal system, the first things we have to understand is what are the different parts of it, right? So you have your bones, which are the classic things you think of when you think of the skeletal system. You have the joints and cartilage associated with those joints that prevents the rubbing, right? The hyaline cartilage, and then the ligaments that kind of hold all the bones together. And the skeletal system is actually divided into two different divisions that we're going to talk about. The first is the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax, which is the ribs. And then the appendicular skeleton, which is basically everything off of that. So here's showing you the difference between those two. We will start talking more about the axial skeleton. That's going to be the first skeleton. We won't really get into much of that today with this, but that is going to be where we're going to start, and we're really going to focus on knowing all of the different bones of the skull, because the skull actually isn't just one bone. It's actually many fused bones that all come together, and we have to know the names of each one of those. So the function of your bones, right? It's to support your body as you stand up, right? It protects certain soft organs. Think specifically like your rib cage, helps to protect your lungs and heart. It helps you to move. They act as levers, and your skeletal muscles, as they contract, will actually move those muscles. Bones store minerals, specifically calcium, and also fat within the bone marrow. And they're also a very important spot for blood cell formation. Both red and white blood cells are created in the bones, in the marrow of the bones. So the adult skeleton has 206 total bones. And when we look at a bone, there's really two types of bone tissue within each bone, and different bones have different concentrations of both of these. But you have your compact bone, which tends to be on the outside of the bone, and that is what, when we look at bone tissue, that's what we tend to think of, right? You can even see it in the picture over here in the corner, that kind of, you see those tree trunks that we said were characteristic of bone tissue. It's homogeneous. It's kind of solid all the way through. And then there's spongy bone, and this isn't spongy like soft. It's just small needle-like pieces of bone. There's a lot of open spaces in there. It's just very porous, but it's still kind of hard. It's almost like a pumice stone, if you can imagine, but even bigger spaces than that. So we classify bones based on shape. The most classic bone we think of is the long bone. That's like the humerus, your radius ulna, femur, tibia, and fibula. But then you have short bones. Those are found in your wrists, your patella, in your ankles. And then we have flat bones, which are the bones of your skull, the bones, your sternum, your ribs, your scapula, and clavicle, all that stuff. And then you have your irregular bones, which are mostly found in your vertebral column, as well as your coxal bones, which is the bones that make up your hip, and your sacrum, which is the base at which your vertebrae kind of sit on top of that pelvis, which holds it all into place. So you do need to know the gross anatomy of a long bone. Remember, gross anatomy is anatomy of structures you can actually see. So you're going to label the bone in your notes, okay, with the different parts as we go through them. So the first thing you want to know is the diaphysis. Some people call it diaphysis, and that is the shaft of the bone itself. So that's the middle part of the bone. That's where the bone marrow is found, within the shaft of the bone. It's mostly compact bone, except for that marrow cavity that's in the middle. As you can see on the side, you can see it's all just compact here. And then on each end of the bone, you have your epiphyses or epiphysis. Sometimes you'll hear it said like that. I prefer epiphysis. The ends of the bones are the parts that articulate to other bones, or articulate means connects to other bones. This is mostly spongy bone, though the outside does have compact bone. You can see here we have spongy bone there. You'll tend to see that's where the red bone marrow kind of is in the heads of the bones, which is what makes red blood cells. And then within that epiphysis, on both of them, both the proximal and the distal, notice it's called proximal because that's the point of insertion, or it's that part of the bone is closer to the point of insertion. So this would be like the head of the humerus, which articulates with the scapula, which is your shoulder blade. And the distal epiphysis or epiphysis is like the part that connects to your radius and ulna, which are your forearm bones. You have the epiphyseal line, which will be an epiphyseal plate in children, and that epiphyseal line is where bone growth occurs when you're still a child, and then eventually that calcifies over. So it's usually hyaline cartilage, and then as it grows, that hyaline cartilage kind of gets remodeled and turned into bone, but the line stays as it migrates and it gets longer. We'll talk about that later. But that is where bone growth occurs from. And then finally, once it ossifies over, and they can tell that in an X-ray because it'll look like if it's still a growth plate, it'll look black on the X-ray. If it has, it'll appear white on the X-ray. So that's how they can tell whether you've stopped growing. Now, if we zoom in on the side of the bone, you can see here we have the kind of a cross-section of the diaphysis or the diaphysis of the bone. You can see the marrow cavity and yellow bone marrow found in the middle. And you can see how well vascularized the bone is too. There's tons of blood vessels in there. So the periosteum is the outside covering of the bone. It's mostly fibrous connective tissue covering it. And then you have Charpes fibers, which are right here. They connect to the bone, the actual bone matrix itself. So that's what keeps it's like the glue that keeps the periosteum on. And then you have the arteries, as I mentioned, that helps to supply them with the bone with nutrients. And again, because it has a good blood supply, that's why the bone tends to heal really well when it breaks. Then you have articular cartilage. That's the cartilage found on the epiphyses of the bone, where any bone kind of matches with another bone to prevent friction when they move on top of each other. So you can see there, it's always made up of hyaline cartilage, here and here. Make sure you label that on both epiphyses. Then you have the medullary cavity. Medulla means middle. That's the center of the bone. That's where or sometimes they'll call it the marrow cavity, because that's where bone marrow sits, the yellow bone marrow that's inside of the bone. If you don't know what bone marrow is like, I don't know if you have if any of your family ever cuts open a ham, like an actual ham with a bone in it, when you cut through that, when you get the cross section of the bone, the inside of it is marrow. You can actually scoop it out, and some people like eating it. I don't know. I don't. I've never actually even tried because I think it's kind of gross. But that medullary cavity has fatty bone marrow in the center of it, and then the epiphyses or epiphyses contain the red marrow for blood cell formation. Now, initially at birth, all of the bone marrow in the bones is red, and then some gets transferred to yellow as you get older. Now we're going to zoom in on the microscopic anatomy of the bone. We have our osteon, which is a Haversian system. The osteon is basically one of those circles or one tree trunk when we looked at the tissue of the bone, right? So that's a basic unit of bone, and they just keep repeating, just like multiple tree trunks. In the center of an osteon, right at the middle here, you have the central or Haversian canal. Sometimes they're called Haversian systems as well. And that carries blood vessels and nerves. So again, you can see how well vascularized that bone tissue is from this cross section. You then have, so those tend to run up and down or vertically. You also have perforating canals which run perpendicularly and also provide it allows the blood vessels to move perpendicularly, whereas the central canals allow it to move horizontally. Now, if you take an individual Haversian system right here and you cut a little piece like it's a piece of pie out of it, and we zoom in, what you then have are even more specific structures, to the point where we're getting almost microscopic at this point. So you have your lamellae, which are the rings of matrix surrounding the cells. Remember, this is a connective tissue, and this is the matrix, that hard kind of calcium, almost rock-like matrix that it has. Inside each crack here, these yellow, orange, red things are cells. Those are called osteocytes. Osteo means bone, cyte means cell. You then have each, and this is how I have you remember this, and I'm going to bring this back up too in the next class when we review this briefly before we move on to new stuff, is we have these little holes that the cells sit in are called lacunae. And the way I think of it and remember it is like lacunae, cocoon, it's sitting in a cocoon. So the cell, the osteocyte, sits in its lacunae, cocoon. Hopefully you don't forget that. Then you have these little cracks that go between the cells. Those are called canaliculi. And canaliculi are like little canals, like canaliculi, like little canal. It helps to transfer nutrients between the cells and allows them to communicate with each other if needed. I don't think there's anything else I need to talk about. Lamellae, lacunae, canaliculi, matrix. I think that's it for that. Make sure you label all of these things. If you need to, pause the video at some point and get these things labeled, all the things that I mentioned. Aha, there we go. So here's it closely. So the lacunae, remember, that's the cavities that contain bone cells. And you can see they're in rings, but then you have the lamellae, or the rings of matrix, that surround the central canal, right? Almost like the tree rings, right? Actually, I'd say like the lacunae and the cavities are almost like the tree rings, and then everything that's like the wood between them is the lamellae. And then the canaliculi are those tiny canals that radiate to transport materials and things around from cell to cell within the bone. Now, interestingly, the human skeleton in embryos, the skeleton's primarily made of just hyaline cartilage, not bone. So when very early on during development, this skeleton's very like squishy. And eventually that cartilage during development over the course of time, over that next 9 to 10 months in utero, but then even after the fact, it becomes more and more ossified or turned into bone over time, but a cartilage will remain in certain places, like the bridges of your nose, right? Parts of your ribs, the joints, your ears, that kind of thing. We talked about this a little bit before. Remember, the epiphyseal plate are the growth plates, and those allow for growth along the long bone during childhood. And new cartilage is continuously going to be formed, and older cartilage is going to be ossified and turned into bone as it grows. And I'm going to kind of show you how this works here. So here you can see there's an embryo, a bone, which is made of cartilage for the most part. And then in a fetus, so still, before the baby's born, you can see there's the heads of the bone are still pretty much just cartilage, where you have some growth in the long bone that's been ossified. And then in a child, you can see this looks more like a bone, but you can see the epiphyseal plate here, which is still cartilage. As it grows, cartilage will grow up this way, and then the bottom parts gets replaced by bone, and it'll actually prune it back and make it just the right shape. You have cells that do that so that the bone is the proper shape as it grows. And you can see that kind of happening here. If I wish, I don't have the ability to, let me see if this works. Maybe it will. It does. That's so nice. So imagine you have a bone here, and here's your epiphyseal plate. The way it kind of grows, I'm going to draw on the other side, grows like this. It seems weird, right? So the bone will actually grow up like that. And then what happens, it'll actually prune away certain parts of it, like this. It'll get rid of this part. So it kind of grows up this way and gets rid of those parts on the side, and that's how the bone actually grows. It doesn't just grow at the shaft, it grows at the top of the heads in the thick part, and then it gets pruned back and gotten rid of, essentially. Last thing we're going to talk about is the homeostatic mechanism in which calcium is regulated in the blood and in bones. So just like blood sugar levels, this is regulated by a negative feedback mechanism, right? Set point, deviate from set point, bring back to set point. So when blood calcium levels become too low, you have a gland that's behind your thyroid gland. There's actually a series of them behind your thyroid called the parathyroid, and they release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone's job is to increase blood calcium if blood calcium levels are too low by breaking bones down. So you need calcium for lots of other processes in your body and your cells other than just for bones. You need them for your muscles, you need them for cell communication, all sorts of things. So calcium is really important. So if you don't have enough of it, you need to get enough of it in the blood, and your bones will be sacrificed if you do not get it through your diet and other means. Parathyroid hormone is the one that actually causes that to happen. Calcitonin does the opposite. So if let's say you drink a lot of milk or something that has a lot of calcium in it, calcitonin will be released from your thyroid, which is right in front, and that'll work in the opposite way. That'll actually lower blood calcium levels because they're too high because you've gotten it through your diet, and it'll actually deposit in your bones, strengthening your bones. So that's a bone strengthener, both of which are important for normal functioning. And you can see here shows you the homeostatic mechanism, just like we've always talked about, right? If it gets too high because of diet or whatever, your thyroid gland releases calcitonin. Calcitonin stimulates the uptake into the bones. And then if it gets too low, the parathyroid hormone causes you to release it from your bones and absorption in your kidneys and in your intestines as well, raising blood calcium levels. And in order to do this, you need vitamin D, actually, and that's why vitamin D is so important as well in your bodies to take up calcium properly when you have low blood calcium levels. I know I lied about that because I want to tie these into the previous step, and then we'll be done for today. So the types of bone cells that exist are osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. Osteocytes are just mature bone cells generally, and we can subclass those into your osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are bone-forming cells, so those will build bone. That's how I think blasts build bone. And osteoclasts destroy bone. I think like this is not a word, but cataclysm or clash. They destroy, they break. So one of which is stimulated by parathyroid hormone, the other one is stimulated by calcitonin. And remember, osteoblasts build bone, so they're going to be stimulated by calcitonin, which takes blood calcium out of the blood and puts it into the bones. Where osteoclasts will be stimulated by parathyroid hormone, and those will break bone down to put calcium back into the blood. Now, also, these blasts and clasts are also involved in bone remodeling, like we talked about, as the bone grows from that epiphyseal plate. So it's kind of an interplay between the two, and both of which are important. All right, that's what we're going to finish with today. If you have any questions, come ask me in person, or you can ask me next class.